The dancing plague began on a sweltering summer afternoon. It was July of 1518, and the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, had suffered several years of unusually warm summers coupled with harsh winters. Famine and disease swept down the Rhine, so much so that residents of Strasbourg began to wonder if they were cursed. That day, Frau Trophäa, or Mrs. Trophäa, stepped out onto one of the city's narrow medieval streets. She raised her hands to the air and she moved her hips to the beat of a song that only she could hear. But this was not a joyful dance. Her face was in agony. Frau Trophäa's dancing continued for several days. Suddenly, more and more residents of Strasbourg joined the dance. By the end of the week, 34 others had joined her, and by the end of that month, hundreds were dancing. The dancing plague of 1518 lasted for about 2 months, and during that time, over 400 people were ensnared in its spell. Potentially dozens of them died. What brought on this sudden mania? And how was the plague finally stamped out? I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. This is probably one of the stranger stories that I've shared on this channel, which for Fireside is saying something. But it's a true story. This really did happen. Not only that, it wasn't the first time that a dancing plague hit communities in Europe. In previous centuries, there were other significant outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing, particularly in the late 1300s. The largest of these medieval plagues was in 1374, with the epicenter around Aachen and Maastricht, and spreading to other towns and cities, including Ghent, Utrecht, and Strasbourg. Historian John Waller points out that of the 10 dancing plagues that broke out in the late 14th century, all were located along the Rhine and Mosel rivers. As one town succumbed to the plague, the others fell like dominoes. Fast forward to 1518, Europe is entering its early modern period, and the city of Strasbourg remains a free imperial city under the domain of the Holy Roman Empire. Strasbourg was also an important city for trade, thanks to its location on the Rhine. When the dancing plague broke out, city leaders immediately tasked physicians with determining the cause of the plague. Initially, they ruled out supernatural causes, instead claiming that it was a disease of hot blood. It's important to note that the dancers were not happy to be dancing. Chroniclers reported that the dancers had pained and contorted expressions on their faces. In moments of lucidity, they would cry out and beg for help. So this was not some sort of summer of love caravan. Something serious was going on. A quick little tea break. Today, I am having a blend for spring allergy season, which is very nearly upon us. This one I know has linden, calendula, nettles, holy basil. I'm pretty sure that there's chamomile in this as well. If stories like this intrigue you, if you're interested in historical mysteries, folklore, ghosts, fairies, you name it, then you should definitely subscribe to Fireside Fables. Subscribing and sharing the channel makes a huge difference, and it helps me to find other fabulous viewers like you. Okay, so you're probably wondering what on earth was going on here. Why were people dancing compulsively for days and days on end? To unpack this, we need to delve into the broader context surrounding the dancing plague, what was happening in the empire, and specifically what was happening in Strasbourg leading up to 1518. Across the Holy Roman Empire, the early 1500s were a time of immense instability. This was right smack dab in the middle of what historians and climate scientists refer to as the Little Ice Age, a period in which temperatures dropped and harsh winters and wet summers were the norm. Cycles of famine caused grain prices to increase. And because landlords were not making as much off of their estates as they had in previous decades, some began to take the rights away of free peasants by turning them back into serfs and revoking their rights to fish and hunt. The Holy Roman Empire was a fragmented cohort of kingdoms and principalities, a powder keg for conflict, coupled with punitive taxes levied on the masses. Not to mention that the political corruption also extended to the Catholic Church. Just 1 year before the dancing plague of 1518, Martin Luther would publish his 95 Theses, launching the Protestant Reformation. Now, specifically in Strasbourg, the local area was dealing with several years of poor harvests and outbreaks of syphilis and smallpox. I should emphasize that things were unusually bad during this period. In the years 1492, 1502, 1511, and 1517, Strasbourg experienced famines caused by extreme summers and winters, which destroyed their crops. Speaking of church leaders, the clergy were engaging in the sin of usury. They were lending out money to peasants with interest, which Catholics are technically banned from doing. But the practice was actually widespread throughout Europe, including merchants, local leaders, landlords, and yes, even clergy. They would disguise interest rates by calling them penalties or fees. And because this was under the table, they could charge exorbitant rates. This contributed to resentment of the ruling classes and the Catholic Church for engaging in this hypocritical practice. This also meant that in addition to famine, disease, and political turmoil, the peasants and the urban poor were drowning in debt. So as you can see, the backdrop of the Dancing Plague was a time of great instability, even by the standards of the period. I mentioned earlier that physicians initially assumed that the plague was caused by hot blood. And this is wild. They basically determined that the dancers needed to dance out the disease. Local authorities responded by clearing public spaces for the dancers, setting up stages, and I kid you not, they even hired musicians to keep the dancing going. As you can imagine, this did not resolve the plague, it only made things worse. Sort of like when a protest becomes a riot, more victims were drawn into the dance by what I would argue was a case of social contagion or mob mentality. More and more dancers joined, dancing for days on end until they collapsed. Allegedly, dozens of people died of heart attacks and strokes. Some accounts reported over a dozen deaths per day, but I would guess that that's probably exaggerated. Nevertheless, the rise in deaths alarmed officials. Clearly, hot blood was not the cause, and dancing it out was not going to solve the problem. People began to suspect that there was indeed a religious explanation, a curse brought to the people of Strasbourg by Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a 4th century Sicilian martyr believed to help those suffering from epilepsy. However, during the 1400s, there were several outbreaks of dancing plagues in Switzerland around Saint Vitus's day, leading to an association between the saint and cases of compulsive dancing. Waller points out that by the late 1400s, curses like "God give you Saint Vitus" and "May Saint Vitus come to you" were well known in the region. The town of Rottweil noted in legal records that anyone cursed by Saint Vitus would be forced to dance compulsively. And in his 1509 Chronicle of Sponheim Abbey, Johannes Tritemius attributes the 1374 outbreak to Saint Vitus. This was a common aspect of the popular religion during the period, in which saints could use their powers to punish sinners just as much as they aided those in need. The threat of Saint Vitus's dance was therefore known to the public. With this in mind, there seemed to be only one path forward: appealing to the saint himself. Authorities in Strasbourg shut down the dancing, sent away the musicians, and forced the afflicted to go to the grotto of St. Vitus in Saverne. The pilgrimage seemed to have the effect of healing them from their mania, and by early September, the dancing plague finally died down. During the 20th century, some historians looked back on the dancing plague and argued that it could be the result of ergot poisoning. Ergot is a kind of fungus that grows on wet grains, particularly rye. If you're familiar with the Salem witch trials, then you'll know that historians in the 20th century also tried to argue that ergot poisoning was behind that instance of social contagion. Though we know today that theory in both cases is uncompelling. Ergot poisoning does cause convulsions and hallucinations, but it's physically debilitating. Someone with ergot poisoning is not dancing to a rhythm, and they're certainly not dancing for days on end. As for Salem, the symptoms of the bewitched girls would come and go, which is not consistent with ergot poisoning. Not to mention that members of their households who were eating the same foods were not exhibiting the same behaviors. I bring up Salem because I think Salem and the dancing plague have two major things in common. First, they are both representative of the religious beliefs beliefs of their era, in which magic and demonic possession are facts of life. Second, they both struck in communities that were dealing with major economic and political hardships. Thus, these cases betray an aspect of the human psyche that can be difficult or uncomfortable for us to reconcile with. Social contagion, or conversion disorder. The power of suggestion, especially during periods of high stress. All of the incidents of dancing plague that we've talked about broke out during periods of famines and disease. Conversion disorder is a mass psychogenic illness that can convince people or convert them that they are all afflicted by some ailment. A modern example of conversion disorder occurred during the COVID pandemic, in which thousands of teenagers decided that they had Tourette's syndrome. To be clear, Tourette's is a very real disorder, one that afflicts about 0.5% of the population. But the vast majority of these children did not have Tourette's syndrome. They were stuck at home, socially isolated, and under the influence of TikTok. Bewitched, one might say. In the case of the dancing plague, this episode of mass hysteria induced altered states of consciousness in its victims. While we'll never know the exact causes, it's likely that the extreme hardships of the period were what triggered this episode. And the flavor of the disorder was influenced by the beliefs and cultural assumptions of the time. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you're enjoying Fireside, make sure that you're subscribed and let me know in the comments if you have an idea for a future video. Be well, and I'll see you next time.